5 years doesn't seem like that long ago, does it? Okay, well, I guess a lot has happened since. 5 years ago, I began my work as a climate storyteller. I moved from Oregon to San Diego to start working with Plant with Purpose, an international nonprofit that planted trees and did a whole bunch of other things. Like, a lot of other things. More on that in a sec. I was hired initially to be the marketing specialist, which is kind of funny because of all the job titles I've ever had. I probably like that one the least. I mean, the job itself was cool. And I like how Seth Godin defines marketing, the generous act of helping others become who they seek to become. Unfortunately, I don't think everyone thinks that way when they hear the word marketing, and I think they just start to worry that I'm gonna sell them something. Anyway, here's the journey that got me to that point. I always knew I wanted to work for an international nonprofit organization solving some big problem. That wasn't a mystery. I read books by nonprofit founders, I interned at some really cool organizations right after college, and I spent a good chunk of my early 20s abroad trying to look for the right opportunity to have a meaningful impact. I honestly thought I might start an organization at that time, but I quickly discovered that sometimes the best way to start doing the work that's right for you is by teaming up with people who are already doing the work. Also, if I'm completely honest, I was having a really hard time committing to a single cause or a single place. In the process of trying to make sure I didn't miss my opportunity to do some good, I discovered so many things that caught my interest, from refugee crises to conflict resolution to poverty. I kind of wanted to work across the entire globe. Like, this isn't the best thing exactly, and if you want to work and make a meaningful difference, I more so recommend committing to something, being focused to a problem, and then along the way finding all the other areas that intersect it. But at the time, I really felt the way I feel when I can't make up my mind about what to watch on Netflix. One thing that appealed to me about Plant with Purpose was that at the time the website looked like this. They planted trees and fought hunger and poverty. They worked with churches, leadership development, justice, health, clean water. It felt like a smorgasbord of good causes. And they were doing that in 6 different countries. Sign me up. Now, I need to clarify that this isn't actually how Plant with Purpose operated. They were a lot more intentional and deliberate with their programs. This was just the impression I was getting from their website. All these things were ultimately interconnected by the issues of poverty and the environment, which are themselves interconnected. Later, I would figure out how to say that and rework the website, but we're not there yet. At the time, I was just really excited about the international context of the work. I was ready to get going. I felt ready to do it. I had my background in international development and in international issues. I saw that the role called for creativity and communication skills, and those were things that I had built up over the years. The gap in my knowledge? It was the environmental stuff. Now, I've never been against the environment, though who actually says that? But outside of like really basic stuff, sustainability wasn't one of those top issues that I thought about very frequently. I had a lot of other friends who seemed much more versed in it, who had more of the passion. I like nature, I like being outdoors, but as far as the details with science or policy, all that was pretty new to me. But I figured I learned everything else on the fly, so why couldn't I do it again? I read the books, I listened to the podcasts, the TED Talks, the documentaries. But the biggest learning opportunity for me came during my first opportunity to visit a Plant with Purpose community in Tanzania. It was there that I saw the effects of climate change firsthand. I saw how the melting snowcap of Mount Kilimanjaro was creating a lot of soil runoff and erosion, devastating the farms right at the foot of the mountain. But I also saw what ecosystem restoration could look like: regenerative agriculture and carbon-friendly farming, tree planting. People in these restored communities talked about cooler temperatures. They talked about birds from their childhood that they thought were gone, reappearing once the trees started to replenish. They talked about how growing more food created better opportunities for their children. That trip made the climate crisis real for me. I saw how it was directly impacting people's lives. It felt urgent and tangible, but also surprisingly hopeful. I saw how communities were the ones leading the change, and I saw how nature seems to have this bias towards healing if we just allow it. Since that point, I've been able to visit a number of different communities. I've continued learning a ton, and I thought I might celebrate this 5-year benchmark in my journey by celebrating some of the biggest things I've learned. Number 1, climate crosses paths with everything. Alright, so far my story has been this case study of how I wanted to get out and work on issues like hunger, or human trafficking, or refugee crises. And what I found was climate change was this underlying root cause of all of that. Now, think about these 3 examples, and there's other examples you can add to the mix. Things like organized crime or the lack of education. It's pretty easy to see how a big contributing factor to these problems is poverty. Well, my mental image of poverty had always been of urban slums in places like Port-au-Prince or Nairobi. In reality, 9 out of 10 people living in poverty around the world live in a rural location. Now, this doesn't just mean that it's harder to get to them or that they have more space. One of the most important things this means is that in order to survive, they grow their own food. And to have an income, they sell the other foods that they grow. Climate change means fewer crops, and so poverty gets worse. And it's actually kind of a tragic cycle because ultimately poverty makes people do more things that contribute to climate change. Things like cutting down trees to sell or burning fields. These days, it's hard for me to think of an injustice that doesn't intersect with climate. Racial injustice, yeah, that's a whole thing. Black and brown communities are exposed to so much more pollution than their white counterparts. Gender? In these rural settings I'm talking about, it's women who are doing the vast majority of the farm work. Their lives are the ones most affected. So climate crosses paths with everything, and after a while I started to see it wasn't just these social issues, but even things like hobbies I was interested in. Travel? I love travel. And that means I love places, and climate change threatens a lot of these places I love. Food? Okay, the list of foods that are on the verge of getting a lot more expensive due to climate change is getting pretty big. Baseball? Here is a totally apocalyptic looking image from 2020 of a baseball game. You have cardboard fans in the stands due to a pandemic, and outside, the sky is literally on fire. Whether it's policy or education or health, food, the outdoors and nature, mental health, whatever your area of interest or passion is, odds are there's a very strong climate thread running right through it. Number 2, you don't actually have to do a whole lot of debating. One of my worries when I first got started was that I would end up spending a whole bunch of time arguing and trying to explain to people how climate change was a real thing. I think if you pay attention to popular media, it can seem like half of the country is super panicked about it, and the other half is in total denial, and we're just locked in a complete stalemate. Thankfully, that really hasn't been the case. The times that somebody has come in looking for a debate are actually extremely rare. And I don't really give people the reaction they're looking for if they want to stir up something, so it typically ends very fast. I put in almost no effort towards proving climate change. I feel like we're past that. I'll welcome sincere curiosity, sure, but I feel like we have too much else to be talking about. The solutions, the stories of people up close. But there are deniers, right? So what do we do about them? Well, they're actually few and far between. There's this survey by Yale called The 6 Americas of Climate Change that just kind of maps out where people are in relation to their attitudes around climate change. And it turns out that the amount of people in outright rejection of climate change is less than 10%. You would go so much farther by working on moving people from apathy into action, or moving people away from giving up back into action, than you are in moving deniers into acceptance. You can leave them alone and we can still accomplish all the goals we need to accomplish. Number 3, speaking of surveys like that, it really helps to be data literate. Now, I don't typically think of myself as a big numbers guy. Math was actually typically the subject in school I found the most dry. In my work, I've kind of offset this gap by surrounding myself with people who are very much math people who are good with numbers. And thankfully, they've been more than willing to take the time to contextualize some of these numbers to help me understand the story that they're telling. From them, I've not only gained an appreciation for data, but I've learned how to look at the context surrounding numbers on paper. Following the data is important. Numbers give us a greater degree of objectivity to help guide our work. That said, they can still be collected and applied and interpreted in ways that reinforce our biases. When it comes to data, it's like knowing your weakness ends up being a strength. Understanding the shortcomings of how numbers are gathered and measured ultimately makes for stronger results. There are 2 common misconceptions around statistics that I used to believe. The first is that they're inarguable, that if you just show people the right statistics, then they'll be convinced of what you're saying. That rarely happens. More often than not, people look for the statistics that affirm what they already believe. In terms of moving people, stories are a bit more effective in getting people to that space of openness. But the other big misconception is that statistics exist outside the realm of storytelling. Like they can't be applied and be part of a good story. Good data visualizations, eye-popping figures, these things can be like the right notes that help carry a song. Here's a couple of my favorite examples, by the way. This book, Factfulness, that shows using data all the ways the world is empirically getting better. And also this graph from a front page of the New York Times last year that shows how climate change is going. This chart was on the cover of the New York Times last week. This is a global warming trajectory of 100 years. The red curve shows the pace we were on. The orange one shows the pace that we're now on, and the difference can be attributed to a lot of changes that have happened since the 2015 Paris Agreement. What ultimately drives home these figures and facts, though, is the power of story, which is why the fourth big thing I've learned is that you've got to bring this global crisis down to eye level. It's easy to look at the public attitudes around climate change and think of all the ways we could have done better in our public communication about the crisis, and there's for sure things I could think of that could have been improved, but also, I've seen public opinion shift on this much quicker than I've seen it evolve on most other things. It simply feels slow because of how urgent and fast-moving the crisis really is. Though one area I think where we could have done a little better is framing the crisis at more of an eye level. What do I mean by that? Some of the earliest voices calling attention towards climate change were scientists, and that makes sense given that they're the ones who have the earliest information available and who are looking at it all the time to evaluate what's going on. But I think it lands differently for a good portion of the country and a good portion of the world to hear the stories from farmers who encounter everyday challenges of rainfall becoming unpredictable and planting becoming more and more difficult. Or even a story from an anxious parent concerned about the future their kids will have with climate change. I mean, at the end of the day, I think we need all kinds of stories told all kinds of ways, just because we're very diverse people, and we need different things to resonate with us. But stories are the things that provoke empathy. That's why I think the bread and butter of my climate storytelling looks like actually going into a community, getting a sense for what the challenge looks like up close, and including people's first-hand accounts as much as I possibly can. The last big thing I've learned over the past few years isn't so much about climate science or storytelling techniques. It's more so about how to take care of myself as a storyteller and an advocate and a creative communicator, because I think this work is important, but I want to be in it for the long haul. That's why I've really had to learn to not get my identity so tightly wrapped up in. Don't get me wrong, what I do is a privilege. It's fun for me, it responds to an urgent need that's out there. It's hard to ask for anything more. But I think for folks who land their dream job or dream jobs or a dream job, you know what I'm talking about, the temptation's almost greater to start to identify yourself by them, especially when that work is around something as urgent and prolific as climate change. But my idea of health and a good life has expanded. I think it's important to love what you do, but to also have a life that you love independent of what you do. When your identity gets really wrapped up in what you do, or the brands you help build, things you're always talking about, you start to lose other parts of yourself, and your persona gets flattened. Not to mention, it gets so much easier for your work to become ego-driven. It's hard to sort out what's a threat to your ego from what's a threat to the planet, and that's not the space I want to be in. To top it all off, I think a lot of our current climate crisis comes from this mindset of growth at all costs, and a lot of that is so closely tied to our fraught relationship with work and trying to find our identity in work. I really don't think we're going to solve this by playing the same game that created it. I started to ask these questions and to see these things a bit more clearly around the start of the pandemic, when the definition of work and its appearance really shifted all of a sudden. And I think we've been having these big, messy cultural conversations around the role work plays in our life ever since that point. Trust me, I'm far from an expert in this, and I still have the tendency to overwork. I catch myself all the time. And with kids in the mix, I'm much more interested in being a healthy, well-rounded, balanced person. Something I've really learned from spending time in places like Italy or France or Argentina and around those cultures is there are other ways to identify yourself than what you do. In these places and many other parts of the world, it is a foreign concept to immediately introduce yourself by talking about what you do for a living. So I'm trying to be better at setting boundaries. I know I'm making this video about work and my experience, but on the whole, I don't talk about work nearly as much as I used to. I remind myself of the other parts of myself, including other opportunities to get creative and talk about climate and do something good for humanity that go beyond the workplace. All right, that's it. Those are 5 things. I feel like there are many more videos to be made about my adventures in climate storytelling and everywhere that's brought me since. In the past 5 years, I've really only just focused on the beginning, but I've gotten to work with some really cool organizations, met some amazing people, and I've gotten to see parts of the world up close that are definitely on the front lines of this global crisis. And these adventures are still being written. I feel like I just gave you the first book of a long series. I've got to park it here for now. I'm sure you'll hear other bits and pieces in videos to come. Thanks for watching. If there's a climate-related topic, especially one revolving around communication that you want me to address, I've been thinking of doing a whole series or sub-series on the broader topic. I'm interested in conversations about the difference between sustainable lifestyles at the individual level versus how to face those broader systemic challenges. There's a lot to talk about there. In the meantime, drop some ideas in the comments and like, subscribe. Stay curious, my friends.